Alrighty, we're good to go. Welcome to class 8. Today, we're going to continue our conversation about modeling clothing that we started in class 7. So I'm going to make this a little bit more free form and kind of just go about my usual process for finishing up this piece of clothing. We are going to touch on the Substance Painter a little bit today, texturing it, and then throwing it into Unity, getting the materials ready, and putting it on your Avi proper. Should be fairly simple. We started off last time with this mesh. So we had it mirrored and we had this kind of shirt going on. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solid start. I would like to kind of begin our class today by solidifying that. I'm going to hide this mesh here. So I'd like to kind of finish up our shirt design and then get to UVing and go from there. We could even add a little bit of flavor on it and add some additional like straps, for example. This is not a hoodie, but we're going to put straps on it anyway, just to show, call it like a tech wear shirt or something like that, just to show that off. But for now, we are going to hide these straps and come back to them later and stick with this shirt. First off, it's still called circle. Let's fix that. Shirt. Cool. So looking at the mesh, we mostly got everything kind of squared away. Some looks like down here, we messed up our symmetry. Reminder from the last class that we had our rotations incorrect on the object, and that's why all of the symmetry mode wasn't working. So that's all fixed up now. Should be good to go. So now we should be able to select this entire line, right? This entire edge loop. It's not really a loop, but same deal. And select the mesh snap to symmetry. And we see that we had two pairs mirrored. It was just these two right here that weren't already on the symmetry line. And we can see X is now zeroed out. Could have done that manually if we wanted to, but that works if your line of symmetry isn't on the 0 axis. So we're going to want to fix a lot of our topology up here because it's pretty bad. Now, I'm not an expert in topology and I don't want to waste everybody's time, so I'm going to do this kind of haphazardly. There's lots to learn on this, and in fact, you can find a ton of good YouTube tutorials on topology in general. Another thing that is good to look up are things like this image. So this is a good guide on flowing your topology from one density to another density. So trying to keep a lot of quads when possible. This 3:1 is a really good example of how if you go from 3 wide to 1 wide, how do you do that in a way that completely avoids any triangles? You use this sort of pattern with this trapezoid shape. You'll see these sorts of trapezoid shapes very commonly in modeling. And in fact, if I were to take some of my existing mesh and subdivide it, you would actually see a lot of these triangles automatically converted into those like trapezoidal shapes, which I could actually do just to show off. If I take our object, and not that we need to subdivide, although we always can, it's an option. Apply our mirror, add modifier subdivision surface, 1, apply. I'm using Control A for that. I don't think you're not seeing my keyboard shortcuts. Screencast is not activated. Fascinating. Oh, there you go. Keyboard shortcuts. Cool. I used Shift A to apply, I think. Anyway, I applied subdivision surface, and you can actually see that it went in and made all of these into quads for us in a way that we have 4 vertices per polygon all over this mesh, even though it's a bit of a weird shape. Subdivision surface might actually be beneficial for us right now because we do want a little bit of extra detail on our shirt. And we can kind of look at a target poly count too. That's another thing we can at least peep to get an idea. Right now, this is 8,000 tries. That is too much. That's definitely too much. But if you have a lot of detail, shrug, whatever. So we're going to go back before I applied the subdivision surface modifier and go back to our original topology and then pre-mirror as well. Cool, back where we started. So we need to obviously fix some of the clipping here. We can go ahead and go into sculpt mode and start to figure this out. We're going to want to smooth a lot of these verts. Reminder that we go over to this viewport overlays and down to wireframe to be able to see the wireframe while you sculpt. And I think there might have been some issue here with our face orientation. Nope, that's good. Cool. You can shift, click, and hold in your sculpt mode to smooth. That's beneficial to get a lot of this geometry looking a little bit more regular. So that will be a good start, especially on this collar up here. We can smooth all of this out and start to make that geometry look more normal. Obviously, it's clipping a lot. We'll get to that in a second. For the actual clipping bits, we can go ahead and go into grab or elastic deform, or draw would work too. And make sure X symmetry is enabled and kind of start to click and drag things out to your desired locations. If you have areas where you want to add more topology, you can always go back to edit mode. You can do Control R to loop cut, and you could loop cut along any given area. So in this case, I want to add more loop cuts around the chest so that I can make that definition a little bit better. So I go ahead and hit Control R twice there, kind of subdivide that topology a little bit. And now going back into sculpt mode, I'll have a much easier time working around that area of the mesh to make it look a little nicer. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Just wanted to get something that doesn't look terrible, so our final product doesn't look terrible. Do a little bit more smoothing here. Sometimes smooth doesn't really work very well when you're doing in mirrored mode, because smoothing doesn't really understand mirroring. So there is going to be a point where we're going to want to break our mirror modifier. This is a great point to save. At some point, you want to apply this mirror modifier. When you do this is actually kind of a difficult decision. And this kind of goes for a lot of different 3D modeling concepts. Workflow is really important. And if you start to do things out of order, you are just creating more work for yourself down the line. And that can be extremely frustrating. So for example, right now, if I were to apply this mirror, I would like to really know that I have everything else on the mesh pretty much solidified, hammered out. It's getting close, but I don't have. I talked last class about meshing into the sleeves to make things look a little bit nicer on the edges. I haven't done that anywhere on the mesh yet. There's this whole collar area that needs a lot of work. And our topology is bad, but I'm mostly just going to be ignoring that, I think, for this class. Mostly because it will take me a while to diagnose why the topology is bad, and I want to save y'all some time. But you could, for example, this seems like a prime candidate for a loop cut. How I identified that, by the way, is just you have a lot of these very big polys in here, especially, like I mentioned last class, in an area that bends. Areas that bend deserve dense topology as a treat. So go ahead and loop cut, give them that. And then we can go back and smooth some of this out just to make it a little bit more regular. Same with like this area of the back. This is a good example where you might want to think a loop cut wouldn't work very well, because a loop cut would travel all the way down the sleeve. And we don't really need more topology on our sleeves. They're fine. But this back area here is kind of not great. A couple of different ways to get around this problem. So let me go ahead and pull up the chat just in case anybody has any questions. Feel free to interject in there. A couple of different ways around this. First off, we can just knife in new topology. And another option is for us to move our existing topology up to compensate. I think the first option is the better one, but I'm going to show the second one first so I can get it out of the way. Using nudge in our sculpt allows us to move existing topology along the mesh in a way that doesn't deform the mesh. So if I want to take our topology and kind of shift it upwards to make this area nicer, I can kind of nudge it upwards using our nudge tool. And it will move all of our existing topology up along the mesh, trying not to deform the mesh, but kind of changing the way our topology looks. And that can be fine in a lot of circumstances, a lot of cases where that actually works really nicely. The kind of same goes for this whole section, right? I can kind of nudge some of this down, make a lot of this more regular, and then kind of interject with a little bit of smoothing. Again, shift clicking to smooth. And that actually already looks pretty good. If we wanted to knife in new topology, we can do that too. So back in edit mode, we can hit K for knife. And let's say we want to give this area of the mesh more definition. We can just hit, left click with our knife tool and kind of go across here all the way over. And then to make tries out of this end area instead of making ugly n-gons. So there's a reason why we don't want to do this, right? If I just end this cut here and leave this as it is, we have incidentally created an n-gon. So if we look at this poly right here, you'll notice there are 5 vertices on this face now. And we don't like n-gons. We try to avoid them whenever possible. There's a whole bunch of reasons behind it. Really, mostly it's just best practice. Honestly, the topology police aren't going to come knocking at your door. It's fine. It's not a crisis, but we like to avoid it when we can. And the way to avoid that is by making tries or quads with this. So an easy way of doing this is to use tries, where we can take this and just cut across and make 3 triangles out of this n-gon. And bam, no more n. Now we have 3 triangles instead. And we're good to go. Other ways we can handle that are with that more fancy method that I wish I could remember exactly how to do. It's a little awkward. I think it's like splitting this in half twice, dissolving this, bringing this guy up and over, and then cutting across here. I'm making a fool out of myself because this is just wrong. That still leaves us with 1 try over there. Whatever. That image I showed earlier, learn this better than I know it because I don't know it very well. I have a friend of mine who likes to regularly make fun of me, in fact, for my terrible topology choices. One more thing worth noting here while I'm kind of working on this mesh, I should share some of the shortcuts I'm using. J is a way for you to join together 2 vertices in a way that splits the face for you. So right now we have 1 big face going across this entire section. If I select these 2 vertices and hit J, it now divides that face up into these 2 separate faces. You can do something similar. If I undo that change, J is for join, by the way, just to clarify. You can do something similar with F, which I think is fill. I think that's what that stands for. Maybe. New edge slash face from vertices. We're going to call it fill. I don't know. That looks like it would work really well and doesn't. The reason why is it does not divide out your mesh. You now look like you have a edge here that divides out this poly, and you don't. And that's a problem. And that bites me very often. So be careful when you're using J. F versus J. You typically want to be joining with J instead of using F. One more thing worth noting is how do I safely delete edges and faces without ruining the mesh? So let's say I do want to go kind of back to where we were and I don't want to just use the undo tool. Well, I'm going to hit J to connect these two vertices like they were before. And now I have these 3 edges here. I don't want these edges anymore. To get rid of them, I can't just hit delete and edges because that will also delete the face. You can go in and fill the face in. And the way you do that is by going over to vertex mode, selecting your 4 vertices and hitting F for fill. Or instead, you can save yourself some time. With those 3 edges selected, hit delete and dissolve edges. That will seamlessly, automatically keep this face intact for you. Dissolving is a great way of deleting things non-destructively or as with little destruction as possible. So I can delete this vertex here and it just seamlessly fills in this whole face to match. And then I can kind of do some knifing here, kind of maybe go across or something like that. Sure, that's topology, I think. Then we can go into sculpt mode, smooth it out, and we now have more dense topology in our back. And if I continue to smooth out the back here to kind of redistribute that topology, we now have a little bit more vertices to work with to shape our mesh. Same goes for the collar line over here, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I'm just going to kind of speed run through this bit so we can move on. And knife across, knife across, knife across. And actually, I think we can just kind of go all the way around here. The loop cut didn't seem to work, which is why I didn't use it. Sometimes your topology, like Blender won't recognize that it's a whole circle, and loop cutting just doesn't really seem to do what you'd want it to do. This whole section up here, I'm just going to grab and move because, again, smoothing across symmetry lines doesn't work very well until you've applied the mirror modifier. And then, like I mentioned earlier, fixing out these areas where we have clipping. Although we are also going to address in this class how to improve clipping in other ways once we get our mesh finished. Any questions while I finish this up?
No.
Cool. Give this maybe a little bit more of a collar line, so kind of bring it down a little bit. Instead of using grab, nudge is a great tool for that. Doesn't mess with the existing shape, brings it down. And up on the collar line, maybe I want this collar to like come out a little bit too, so I could always extrude and kind of come up and out and around to make an actual collar on the shirt. Whoa, crazy. Fast collar. I used E for extrude for that, by the way, so I hit Alt-click to select the edge loop, and then E and extrude it up and extrude it around. And then I could sculpt that out. It's not really very good. Sometimes you do have to just go in and manually move your verts. One thing that can be useful for that is proportional edit mode, which is O. O, proportional edit mode, effectively allows you to move a large area of the mesh when you're doing vertex operations, similar to sculpt mode, but you're in edit mode. It can be very useful. In this case, I'm actually not going to use it. I'm just going to go manually kind of move my verts around. Sometimes it's just faster. I typically try to avoid that because it kind of sucks, but you got to do what you got to do. And fill in and snap both of these to symmetry. Oh, one more great thing to note. This is a part of my workflow I should have learned a long time ago and didn't. Turns out a lot of these moments happen all the time. This operation doesn't have a shortcut, and that's really annoying. You can fix that. You can right-click here, and you can do 2 different operations, either add to quick favorites or assign shortcut. Assign shortcut will allow you to just pick a key to press. I'm going to say, like, I don't know, something I don't already use. So, like, Control-Shift, backslash. Backslash doesn't work. Control-Shift, plus. You get the point. Or it did assign it, so Control-Shift equals. Perfect. So that's an easy way. You can do this anywhere on the UI effectively. You can just right-click and assign a shortcut to something that doesn't already have a shortcut in Blender. Or you can right-click and add to quick favorites, and then you can hit Q wherever you want to access your quick favorites menu. This is incredibly cool. I didn't know this existed until literally yesterday, and it's going to change my life. And one more thing worth noting, if I made out this whole kind of manual collar section, and I think it needs a lot more dense geometry all across it, I can select the entire face. Quick way to do that, you can again use Alt-click. Even on faces, it will try to grab the whole face loop, and then manually select whichever ones it doesn't grab. And then you can just right-click subdivide, and boom, now I have more topology to work with. And I can go ahead and finish this up, and we can move on with our lives. Doesn't have to be perfect, although easier said than done, because I will sit here and tweak things while saying, no, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just one more little change. Just one more little change. over and over and over again until class is over and I still haven't finished meshing the shirt. Bring this collar down a little bit. There is a way to, I need to go figure out, auto masking topology. I really wish I knew how to do this. One of these days, I will figure it out. There's a bunch of options on exactly how your brush applies to the scene, but that is not a topic we're going to cover today. Cool, that is a shirt. Minimal clipping, decent topology. Now we have to go get the sleeves real quick. I'm actually gonna move these sleeves up just a smidge. Go into edit mode, alt click. I used numpad period to zoom in on an area. And then we're gonna extrude. I hit E and then right click to extrude but not move, and then scale. Move it along the x-axis a little bit with G and X. Same thing again, extrude, scale. Move it along that axis a little bit, extrude, scale. And then maybe move some of this out a little bit. There's a better way to move into sculpt mode, but I'm not gonna bother to remember how to do that. Cool, that's a sleeve. It looks like it has like thickness now, right? It clips into the mesh, but that's totally fine. And then we can do the same thing down to the bottom. Right, so I can go over to edit mode, select the loop. This is gonna be a little bit more difficult down here because of the bagginess I have on this right now. I guess we can just make it more form-fitting, or we can leave it as it is. Like this is fine, it's acceptable. Or just add a little lip, that'd be fine too. So we can kind of scale ourselves inwards just a smidge, go down a little bit, and then do another extrusion, scale it inwards, and go up a little bit. And that works too. Doesn't have to be perfect, right? No, there is a bit of a hook in there if you could look really deeply, but at a casual glance, it looks like it has a depth. It doesn't have to clip into the mesh to do it, and it looks all right. So we could just keep that. That's fine. So we have a shirt. Now that the modeling is done, we can apply our mirror modifier, finally. If we ever wanted to add any imperfections or asymmetries, here's where we'd do it. So I could absolutely, first off, I'm gonna go save, add a little bit of asymmetry now. So on the sleeves is obviously going to be a good candidate for that. You could like turn off your symmetrical modifier and start to make just little changes in a way that makes it maybe snake hook a little bit around here. Just little things, right? Give it a little bit of flavor, make it so they aren't perfectly symmetrical with each other. Cool. That's all I'm going to do for this Avi. If you wanted to make a lot more, we talked about this a little bit. If you wanted to make folds on the Avi too, you would want a little bit denser geometry in that area. So like, let's say I wanted to make the shirt seem like it was like crumpled up at the ends, right? I'd want to go take this geometry and really, so I'd Control R and then scroll up to increase the number of loop cuts. Do that multiple times over across this. And then I could go to town in my sculpt mode and kind of do whatever little random stuff you wanted to here. Give it some additional flavor. It's a bit excessive, but you get the point. And the geometry is different on these two sides. It will lead to problems later on, but I'm not gonna worry about it actually for right now. But if you wanted to fix it, easy enough. Again, just loop cut, same operations on both sides. That's one reason why to avoid applying your mirror modifier too early, because now I was forced to go do that operation twice. Now, we're gonna talk about normals. So, when we right click on this, there's shade smooth and shade flat. You've obviously been seeing shade smooth this whole time. Shade flat looks very blocky because you're seeing the normals as they truly are. You're basically taking and projecting orthogonally out of each of these quads straight outwards, and that's where it looks like the light is coming from. The purpose of shade smooth is to blend across to make it seem like the object is curving naturally through normals. And we can use our normal lighting mode in matcaps over to kind of see that a little bit better. So we can see that each one of these squares is a solid color, and that signifies that it all shares the same normal value. When we shade smooth, it blends it all the way across, and it gives the impression that we have a really smooth fabric instead of just a bunch of square polygons. But there's a problem with that. And that problem can come in when we want things to actually look sharp, even though they're on a shade smooth Avi. And to do that, we can mark things as sharp. So this collar is a good example. We want this edge of the collar to stand out and to look sharp. Another example we could use was for like a cuff of a sleeve. So if you wanted a cuff of a sleeve to really stand out, you can mark as sharp. So I'm gonna right click and mark sharp here, but I'm also going to add this to my quick favorites so I don't have to do it again. And now if I were to go in and take a look at this model, I'm gonna leave my matcap mode. Actually doesn't look as clear as I'd like it to. I wonder if I can further accentuate that difference. It's gonna have to work for now. Effectively, it makes sure that you don't have a smooth line across that edge, and that edge is marked as sharp. This is a good example of this is a world that I'm currently working on that actually can show that off really nicely. So you often want sharps when you have sharp edges. So in this case, of course, we had our collar. So this would be marked as sharp as well. So right click, mark sharp. And then in our shade smooth, it automatically does it for us. Same with like this collar right here is a good example. This could all be marked as sharp if we wanted it to be. Anywhere where you'd expect a sharp, clearly defined line. Subdivision messed with our loop cuts, so I'm just going around doing it manually. And mark sharp. And you can see now that it has a clearly defined normal as opposed to before, where kind of the shading looks a little bit weird, like it's trying to like loop around. So we mark sharp. That's a little bit more obvious in hard surface modeling than it is clothing, and I think that's why I'm having a hard time showing this off. If I were to do just like a simple hard surface modeling tip over here and made like a circle, fill in the circle, extrude it up, inlay, extrude down, bevel, like that. Sure. So I made this, whatever you want to call this. It's almost like a bowl, but not. If I were to, this is obviously shade, this is shade flat right now, so you can see the definition on every single square. If we were to shade smooth this whole interior section looks really kind of weird. The shading doesn't look consistent across the interior, and that's because it's trying to blend our normals outwards. I think it's even more obvious if I were to poke this surface, which puts a vertex in the middle, kind of draw it down a little bit to really accentuate the problem. This doesn't look like a clean edge. It's trying to blend across the normals, and we can see that again in our matte cap view, where it has a gradient color across this. So to fix that, we can take this edge and mark it as sharp. And that will have a marked difference in normals. And you can kind of do the same thing every other place where you'd expect a sharp edge. And now it looks like it's shaded a little bit more properly. This is really important in a lot of different hard surface modeling, including in clothing. So if I were to show, or in world creation, stumbling over my words. So if I load up another instance of Blender, wow, taking its time. Cool, thank you. And I'm looking at a building, right? A lot of different building stuff is going to need sharp. So you see every single one of these cyan lines is marked as sharp, which is basically the whole thing at this point, right? But if you don't have it marked as sharp, you can see, like, for example, we have this little overhang here. If I take all of this and mark it as smooth instead, it will look much, much worse. I'm gonna take all that, sure, and clear sharp to mark it as smooth. You see how it kind of looks more rounded now and not as defined? So I think that's a little bit better of an example than the clothing is, versus now it's all sharp and clear. That's an aesthetic thing in this case, but just understand the difference. Now, getting rid of this, going back to our clothing. The next topic is UVing. We have a piece of clothing. This is done. This is its final form. We aren't going to change it. We're going to save. Now we want to go texture it. A couple of different ways we can do that. But firstly, we are going to want to UV it. UVing a model is basically, if we look at its current UV, we can go to our UV editing workflow and then hit this UV sync selection button up here at the top left. And we can see our current UVs, they don't exist. They're down here in the corner. You can move them around, but they're just dots, which means that if you were to apply a texture to this object, I could go take and apply, if I go over to the shading tab and give this a material over here, new, type in shirt, name my material. If I were to go give this a image and I can open up, I have a concrete texture. That makes for a good shirt. Is it diffuse? What is that? Bear with. Oh, it is diffuse. Okay, cool. Sure. So we're gonna make a concrete shirt for right now in Blender, at least. If I were to apply this concrete texture, this is what our concrete texture actually looks like. If I were to apply it right now without any UVing, this is what it will come out as. Go back to our studio lighting, go back over here. It's just a solid color. I'm like, why is it a solid color? Because we don't have UVs. So you can even go like reset our UVs. I'm not even sure what that'll do. That'll just tile them all. So if we reset our UVs, we now have concrete, but it's being tiled over and over and over again. Basically the same image is being tiled one after another after another. Obviously also not what you want. So to do a UV of our objects, the simple dirty way of doing a UV is to hit U for unwrap and then Smart UV project. Smart UV project will try to figure out the best way to unwrap our clothing along sharp angles. This is a terrible way of doing it, by the way. I'm just sharing like the lazy way. But you can see how it mostly grabbed the right things. Like it grabbed most of the front of the shirt in one UV island. This is a UV island, by the way. Kind of understanding a UV workflow is important. You're taking your polygons and mapping them onto texels or texture pixels. And you're doing that by adding seams, which create UV islands. UV islands are like this whole bit of the shirt. And you can move around this island and actually see the texture move around as you move the island. But you're going to see a lot of weirdness in this texture along seams. So you'll notice how this line right here doesn't blend. I mean, there's a completely different texture on one side of it than the other. Using this kind of monochromatic texture doesn't make that obvious, but you can see along the seam, right? It doesn't connect. To fix that, we want to use better seams on our UVs. So smart UV project, not going to work very well. So to actually create good UVs, we need to create seams on our object along edges we actually want to make islands out of. For clothing, we actually have oftentimes a natural way of doing that, which is along actual seams of the clothing. So kind of take where you'd actually put a seam in your clothing, for example, down the side here. Do the same on the other side. I don't think our symmetry is going to work correctly here, so I'm gonna have to do this manually. Again, we can use our orthogonal view to make sure we select the right thing, hitting 3 and making sure these line up like we talked about last week. And we can right click and mark seam. I'm gonna add this as a quick favorite. And that makes a red line across. So we had cyan lines for sharp, red lines for seams. Seams will allow us to unwrap our object a little bit more sensibly. Right now, it wouldn't do anything because effectively what unwrapping is doing is it tries to find one contiguous way to flatten out your object onto a 2D plane along these seams, similar to a globe. When you think about a globe versus a map, if you just try to flatten out a sphere onto a rectangle, it doesn't really work. That's why we have projections for maps, right? Because you can't just perfectly lay out a sphere onto a square. Something's got to give. So if we tried to use unwrap here along our seams, you can hit U and unwrap. It will just create one gigantic texture for our shirt, and it's not very uniform either. So we can see this little tiny section down here represents the entire sleeve, but it did correctly go along these lines here. So we can see these lines we made make up the lines of our seams of our UV map. And it raises a good point, which is that we can use the edges. Oftentimes I'll use my unwrapped version to determine where my next seam placement should go. So like I realize now these are the sleeves down here and then over here. These could definitely be sharps. So I can right click, mark sharp. Same with this interior here. I did sharp, I meant seam, sorry, brain. This interior here, this represents, of all things, a sleeve, I think. I don't know why we can't see into the mesh right now. Probably because I have this option selected. So I can go ahead and mark this as a seam as well. So I'm kind of taking every place where we would have a seam on the real clothing or where it's the edge of the clothing. And now to kind of split the shirt in half from the front and from the back, we're gonna add a seam along the top of the sleeves as well. So seam there, seam here. So those line up. We can check our orthogonal view to be sure. Yes, they do. And now if we unwrap, we can actually see why on our UV view over here on the left, why adding a seam here will work. It splits it in half. We can see we have cleanly have our back half and our front half here. So now that I've added a seam, if I go back to unwrap, it recognizes that we have two entirely separate halves of the object and creates two separate UVs for it. So we have our front half as an island and our back half as an island. And that's already enough. You could just work with this. Now, it's not perfect because our sleeves get a little bit weird, and we can improve that. If we'd like to, we can add a separate seam along our sleeves just to unwrap those separately from the rest. So add a seam along those sleeves, select all again, unwrap again, and now we have 6 UV islands. The more you unwrap, as a general rule, the more you unwrap, the less distortion you're going to get on your image. If you are not careful with your unwrapping, you'll get a lot of really odd distortion. There's an easy way to check for that too that I think is really valuable. If we go back to our shading tab here to modify our texture, we can create a color map. So if I go to image texture color, new, call this color map, swap our generated type to color grid and new image, it will create this little helpful grid for us. So if we go back to our UV tab, we can see what this grid represents. It has just squares from A1 to H8. And each of the rows have different colors. Each of the columns have different colors or whatever. And each of these little smaller tiles change in color slightly. This will help us understand if we've UV'd our thing well. Because if we look at our generated UVs, we can see if there's any stretching or any weirdness visually, because ideally, all of our text should be about the same size, right? All of these squares should be about the same size. If we go back to the version we had before and use this same texture, where like I didn't have this seam or this seam or this seam, sure, didn't have any of these, clear seam and unwrap, We go back to this image that we had before, or just a single island. You'll be able to see a lot of this stretching a little bit more apparently, especially on the sleeves. You see how these numbers are huge over here and they're much smaller over here, and it kind of doesn't look quite right. It's still not bad, all things considered. You could actually roll with this, like it would work, but it's not good. So that's why we use multiple seams across our mesh to give us a more consistent view. Notably, a lot of times you're going to want a image, like on a t-shirt, you might want like a graphic tee. It can be good not to put seams in places where you want a contiguous texture, especially with one with a lot of detail. So I left the entire front of the shirt as one UV island, which is this whole section right here. That way, if I ever want to apply an image onto this part of the shirt, I can just slap it basically right there and it would just work, which I can show off later in Substance Painter. You might also consider adding a seam on your collar, right? So I could go ahead to take this collar and mark a seam there. Same deal, unwrap. Oop, I got rid of my other seams. Let's fix that real quick. Cool. One more thing worth noting. I don't think these connect back here. Interesting. The unwrapping process does not do its best job to pack your UV super tightly together. There's a separate operation to perform that. So unwrapping just kind of lays them out logically, but if we want to make it to get the most bang for our buck out of our texture, we can pack them. So we can go right here to our UV tab and go to pack islands. We want to give it some amount of margin, click OK, and it tries to fit together all of your different islands in the most compact way possible to make the most out of your texture space. Having a little bit of margin is important. Margin is basically the amount of distance it puts between UV islands. So if I try to pack again, once again, I'm going to add quick favorites, and I add a large margin of like 0.1, it's going to add a huge amount of space between every UV island. So the distance between this island and this island is massive. You want a little bit of space, but you typically don't need very much. The reason why you want a little bit of space is because your texture density is finite and relatively small. Typically, you're working with like a 1K or a 2K texture, which means you either have 1,000 by 1,000 pixels or 2,000 by 2,000 pixels. It's powers of 2, so it's 1024 and 2048. If you have your UV islands too close together, you might suffer from texture bleed, which is the idea that if you have a completely different texture on one island than the other, and you put them too close to each other, you might start to see the texture from one island on the other, and that can be a problem. So having at least a little bit of margin is good when you pack your islands. Typically, something even as small as 0.002 is going to be enough. And there we are. That is a finished UV map for our shirt. And that's done. The actual modeling portion is finished. There's a couple of other things we can do though. One thing we might want to do is preemptively try to avoid clipping on our model. There's a couple of different ways we can do that. We might notice that as we go to weight paint this thing and move around our bones, that we get a bunch of clipping in our elbows and our joints in general. As I mentioned last time, we have the ability to add UV discards to just hide parts of the body we won't see under the shirt. For example, if we go back and look at our mesh and hide the shirt for a second, we could safely delete, I have to Alt-H to unhide the things I hid earlier. We could safely take all this, all this, all this, most of this, if we are careful. It's obviously a little haphazard. I could use X-ray mode to capture stuff through the mesh too, which I should have done from the get-go. None of this will be visible through the shirt. We could just, if you're making an optimized model, you could just delete this, right? Put our shirt back on, nobody would ever be able to tell, except for that right there. Dangers of deleting too much. But oftentimes you're not gonna wanna do that. You're gonna wanna do UV discards instead. The way to set up a UV discard, more complicated, but not too bad.
And would that also help with clipping by doing that?
Yes.
So you don't see it?
You can't see it. It's not there.
No longer there?
It's not there anymore. Yeah, of course. Since it's not there anymore, it's not going to clip. But you've got other ways of doing it too. You can set up a UV discard, which effectively is going to be taking this part of our UV and moving it. So it can move just these areas of the mesh over by 1 square. So what I'll do for that is I will take those in face mode, move them over to the side by exactly 1 meter on the X and 0 meters on the Y. This is UDIM tiling, which is some topic we're going to need to discuss in detail at a different time. But effectively, you get a 4x4 grid externally from extrapolate it out from your initial box and extend it of 3 upwards and 3 over to make a 4x4 grid of a total of 16 UDIM tiles that you can use to control your UV discards within Poiomi. So I could make it so this whole tile gets discarded independently. So all of those parts of the body disappear. We're not going to worry about that right now. That's too advanced for what we're trying to discuss at the moment. We can also use blend shapes. is another thing I want to discuss on that front. So if we don't want to, for whatever reason, actually get rid of the geometry underneath the mesh, we can instead make it smaller. So let's say we want to just make our elbows smaller to avoid clipping. We can use a blend shape for that, or a shape key. So I can go over here and hit plus on shape keys to make a new shape key called this shirt on. And then if I were to sculpt, I could, with this shape key enabled, so make sure you have it activated. You can set it to 1 as well, just to have that. Go to the inflate deflate tool. Deflate, that's the wrong direction. Why is it doing that? It's a little strange. Usually it goes inwards, not outwards. What am I doing wrong? Oh, I was using the blob tool. So inflate tool, much better. I could use the inflate tool and make all this a lot smaller. On the inside here, do the same thing over here. It's gonna look strange, doesn't really matter. People won't be able to see it anyway. The whole point is to just make this interior mesh a little bit smaller so that clipping doesn't happen. And then you can toggle basically this blend shape on and off. So if I go over back in object mode, I can shift this shirt on shape key from 0 to 1 to dynamically make that area of the elbow a little bit smaller. So I would dynamically turn this on while the shirt is on to avoid any clipping that might occur in the elbow. Just a nice little trick that can be used. And lastly, we need to actually put this on the armature or it won't deform with our mesh. We've talked about this in previous classes, so I'm gonna speed through it real quick. We need to go to our sense weight painting tool, select a shirt, copy from the body, transfer weights. It'll grab all the vertex groups correctly for us here, or at least good enough to start with. I could probably use slightly better. Oh, I already have it set up. Cool. I turn on smoothing with a small smooth factor. And then I also need to apply an armature modifier. So armature, add the correct object, which is our armature object, and then move it into the hierarchy as well. Moving things into hierarchies kind of sucks in Blender. It's really weird. I don't know why it's done this way. There's probably a better way. I don't know what it is. And that's you click and drag, then hold Shift and Alt, drag into the armature, drop. Shift is important to actually change parents. Otherwise, it just moves collections. And then Alt keeps your transforms, which makes sure it's in the same spot. So bang, now it's a child of the armature. It has the armature modifier on it, and it has all of our vertex groups from our weight painting. So we can actually go look at our weight painting and go see our hips are here, our chest is up here. It looks about how you'd expect it to. This is our right shoulder, and going down the line. Sometimes you'll see odd weight painting where you have like these little blobby areas. That can be indicative of either not enough smoothing or not dense enough geometry. We can just apply smoothing to try to fix this. We can go over to weights, smooth, and then change the modifier over here. I'm gonna do all groups. I'm gonna do like iterations of 5 and a factor of like 0.2 and see if that improves things. So now if we go back to our right shoulder, we can see that it's a little less rigid, and that might improve how the final product deforms. We can of course check our deformations by going into pose mode. So we can select our bones, go to pose mode, and move around our arms and go see that our shirt moves with our arms. We already see some clipping. Let's see if our blend shape we applied actually works here. That would be cool, wouldn't it? If our shirt, we already applied it. So no, that didn't work. You can apply it after the fact too. You can go back into sculpt mode while we're posed and actually just move things around with our shape key enabled. So I could just go take this part and just move it in. Just kind of do one of those. This is bad weight painting anyway. You can see that the shirt is deforming really weirdly, but we're going to gloss over that fact. And I can kind of just move these things around, clip them into the mesh like it doesn't matter. That's bad because now we see we have stuff over here that's out. But do the same over here. What's the worst that could happen? And now it doesn't clip. If we had our shape key off, it clips. And as you enable the shape key, it's not clipping as much. Lots of better ways of fixing that problem than the shape key, but I wanted to at least bring it up because you might see it on a lot of models. It's very common, especially with shoes. You see it all the time with shoes, where they will make the feet smaller inside the shoe for some reason. But yeah, you can verify your posing by posing the Avi. This weight painting is terrible. It's awful. We can try to improve it. To reset our pose, we can hit in pose mode, hit A, and then Alt R to reset rotations. We can try to improve this. I might just go ahead and do another pass. This might just need more topology in certain areas too. This is pretty sparsely popular, like sparse density of topology. But I might go like surface mode. I might change my smoothing factor a little bit and then try transferring weights again. And then go back to pose mode by selecting our armature, go to pose mode, and then double check. Try again. Still looks kind of bad. Interesting. We can manually weight paint if we want to. That's another option. So we can go find a pose that looks bad like that. And then we could go, this is a little bit weird with symmetrical objects, but you could go into weight paint, go kind of find what's deforming incorrectly. In this case, our chest is applying too heavily down here. And then we could just set our weight to 0, strength relatively low, radius relatively low, and then just kind of paint until it looks better. Still not perfect, but better. Weight painting sometimes manually is beneficial if you run into these sorts of issues. You can kind of do the same thing on the other side if you really wanted to by posing towards that side and checking things. And you know, to run the whole gamut. You can also do this in game, but obviously this is faster because you don't have to load it all the way into VRC. So this actually looks mostly decent. I'm going to roll with it just to move on. We're actually already at class end. Wow. Time flies. So this is our final product. We now have a shirt. Let's go ahead and add some dangly bits to our shirt before we end class and call it good there. We're not going to touch texturing. We've gone over UV maps. We've gone over sharps. We've gone over seams. We've gone over sculpting and weight painting. Now, let's talk about what will eventually be Physbones, effectively. So let's make like a little strap on the shirt. We can make it like tech wear, right? So let's say I want to have a strap hanging down from the side at the bottom, right? So I can put my 3D cursor by shift right clicking wherever I want to place my strap, make a new object. And I'm going to kind of speed run through this process real quick here. But effectively, I'm thinking just like a small 3D strap, right? So I'm going to make a cube. I'm going to rotate my cube. I'm going to scale it to kind of be more representative of a real strap. Place it about where I think it should be. And then I can hit E to extrude. That's still too thick. Sure. And we can kind of extrude down. I don't know why it's automatically locked into an axis. I need to figure out why it's doing that. It's weird. Sure, that's a strap, right? And it counts. If we wanted to have straps on both sides, that's easy. Mirror modifier. I mean, this is a separate mesh for now. We're going to join them together later. So if I have a mirror modifier, I could mirror along the x-axis and select a mirror object of the body. And bam, it's now on the other side. I could also make this look better by beveling. Real straps are going to be of a little bit more of a curve to them. So I can select these edges, shift alt clicking, and then Control B to bevel and kind of give them that little curved look. They can probably be a little bit thinner as well. I'm using scale and then I'm double tapping Y for this, which transforms along its local Y axis. And we have straps. Those are close enough. And then you can kind of attach them up here. Proportional edit can be good for this. Turn on proportional edit, move, rotate, whatever I need to do here. And then I could add some edge loops too if I feel like I'm not getting enough control over the mesh. This can also be done with paths. When we cover hair, we'll cover how to make meshes with paths, which I would like to cover hair soon. It's a really fun topic. But we can go ahead and kind of move this in like that. Sure, and that's the strap. That's good enough. Doesn't have to be perfect. Now, for straps, if we wanted to weight paint this, we need to go add bones. So typically this is pretty simple to do, actually. Make new bones. We can go into our armature and go to edit mode, and we can hit Shift A for add, and that will create us a new bone. Oftentimes I actually like to be in our other view for this instead of stick mode. I prefer the default octahedral mode. So I go over to this data tab while we have our armature selected and go to octahedral. That shows us directions of our bones a bit nicer, which is good when actually editing your armature. So I had my 3D cursor at the place where I wanted to start the bone, and I hit Shift A to add a bone while I was in edit mode on the armature. And now I can just kind of move it down. I can kind of just manually place our bones along the strap. Extrude with E, and do this a couple of times. I can extend a little bit past, that's fine. And now we have a whole bunch of new bones. Now we need to add weight painting to those bones. We can go do this manually if we really wanted to. You can hit the plus button on vertex groups. We need a name for these bones too. I forgot to name them. So I'll go over here. This is just called bone right now. I should have done this before extruding. Getting ahead of myself, so I'm actually just going to delete these bones. Rename this bone to strap. Strap to L. Strap to R. It's the right side, not the left. Figuring out where to parent your bone is important too. You need to parent your bone basically wherever you expect the base deformation to be. So if I were to put a strap on the arm, I would want to parent this bone to the arm. Since this strap is basically on the hips, I'm just going to keep it parented to this hips right here. The way to do that is to select the bone in edit mode. Select the bone you want to be a parent last by shift clicking, and then Control P, which is make parent, and then keep offset. And now we can see there's that dotted line going across, and we can see that strap.r is a child of hips. Oftentimes, too, you might have a root bone. This is perhaps too complicated of a topic for right now, but if you ever see what are good examples of root bones, hair might have a root bone and then a bunch of other bones extending out of it. That's useful for setting up our Physbones later, because you only have to use a single Physbone component instead of having to use one for the strap right and one for the strap left. We're going to keep them separate for now. We will definitely cover that when we cover hair. So I'm going to re-extrude these bones like I did before. The leg bones being in front is not ideal. Cool. There we are. Now, to actually start weight painting this, we could do this manually. Now that we have strap R001, strap R002, etc., you could go over here, go over to our vertex groups, add a new vertex group, call it strap.r.001, go over to your weight painting tab, find that bone and start painting, right? Add some weight and, start drawing. This is a terrible choice, by the way, if you can't tell the sarcasm in my voice. Don't do it this way. But it's possible. Like, you can turn on auto normalize, which it's already on, even better. I don't even know why it's not selecting that vertex as I draw here. Very strange. I wonder if that's a normals issue. Oh, yeah, the normals are entirely reversed on this strap. So to fix normals, first off, I went to viewport overlays, face orientation here to go see the normal direction. To fix normals, you can select all of your vertexes in edit mode and hit Shift N to recalculate. And that will find the outside direction and face all of your normals in that direction so they're all blue. If you want to be inside, you can select that checkbox down here and it will face all of your normals to the inside. Oftentimes for world stuff, you want that because you want all of your normals to face inside the room instead of outside the room. And now if I did my normals again, it would work. But we have a better way than manually weight painting. So we're going to get rid of that vertex group and show the automatic way. So the way we want to be able to do this automatically is with automatic weighting. So we should be able to click our object, then shift click our armature, then Control P, which brings up the Set Parent To menu again. And then there is this armature deform with envelope weights, with automatic weights, and with empty groups. Empty groups will give us all of the vertex group names, but won't do anything for us. We want to either use envelope weights or automatic weights, depending on the context. And if we do that and did it right, in theory, we'll see our vertex groups over here. Way more than we need, but I bet you it actually did it right if we go to our weight painting tab. And see, strap R is the top of the strap. 001 is down a little bit. 002 is down a little bit, matching the bones perfectly. Some of these other, like the left leg might have gotten a little bit of painting in here. Looks like it didn't. We got lucky. To fix this, you can either just go remove these vertex groups that don't affect it. So I know that the head, for example, is not going to affect this strap. Get rid of the vertex group. Doing that all the way down the line. Only keeping the straps, which is a pretty terrible way of doing it, to be honest. But there you go. Now you have strap R1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can double check our work. Oh, by the way, a way to do that better without having to remove all those vertex groups is to not basically have a separate armature for just these bones. Then do your weight painting, then merge armatures together to put these bones on the rest of your armature. Also, it looks like our collar normals are bad. Whoopsies. Easy fix. One thing you might want to do is select by UV island. You can hit L to do that. So either on the UV map here, I can hit L, which will select just that UV island, or on the mesh, you can hit L, and down here, you can select seam. And then I can select these 4 areas that encompass the entirety of the collar. Shift N to recalculate normals, and bam. There's some weirdness here underneath the collar, worth noting. Because this is a 2D object, your normals underneath the collar are going to be wrong. If you really care and want to have a separate texture underneath the collar than above the collar, you're going to have to do something fancy like solidifying. We're not going to really go over that right now, but it's not too hard to do. You could do something along the lines of separating by selection, which makes it into a separate mesh, adding the solidify modifier, adding some depth to it, change your offset, something like that, which adds some thickness on the top and on the bottom. I'm going to fix our bones. This is really annoying. There we go, back to sticks. So that adds some thickness on the top and the bottom. Then you can go ahead and apply your solidify modifier and rejoin it to the original mesh. Now, notably, you'd have to re-UV this. Shouldn't be too hard, right? Right, A, unwrap, then pack islands again, and bam, we've already fixed our UVs. All done. And now we have a thickness on our collar so that you can apply a different texture on the top of the collar and on the bottom of the collar. Also, I like how I said I wasn't going to go into it and then went into it. That was pretty cool.
Really cool.
It's cool stuff. I'll show off real quick here before we actually end that posing works here now. So I can pose this strap and it does move the strap as you'd expect it to. So If we were to take this into Unity, we could go ahead and add a Physboned to it, and it would work as you'd expect it would.
Interesting.
There's a way to mirror bones as well. I don't know what it is. I'm sure there is a way. I don't know. You can always just look at the menus and go see symmetrize. Whoa, cool. It even renames them. So strap R and strap L. It just does it. It just works. Then you could add automatic weighting for this guy over here as well, right? So I could go back over to object mode, apply my mirror modifier to actually go create this side, and then split by loose parts to make a separate object for this guy. Go over to our vertex groups, remove all of the right side vertex groups, do the same thing where we did shift click and then control P, automatic weights. Go select all of our vertex groups and remove all of the vertex groups that are not our strap L by clicking 1,000 times. There's probably a remove empty vertex groups. I don't know where that would be though. Probably a tool for it somewhere. Blender's crazy. And then remove right side straps, keep just left side straps, and bam. Now, if we go back over and pose, I can rejoin these meshes together. Join, join. Now our shirt is all just one object again. And if I were to go to a pose mode, we can pose these straps separately and turn off symmetry mode. Pose these straps separately, and they're painted themselves. And that's how you'd add little strappy bits. Same thing like ribbons or, what have you, whatever. Even flowy sleeves. People will make like sleeves that are like dangle down and like flow. You could do something very similar here with bones. Just works.
Just works.
It just works. After a mountain of effort and knowledge, it just works.